The gunshot that killed Georgia Harper's father echoed through the canyon long after his body hit the dusty ground. And she knew in that moment that her life in Roswell, New Mexico, had just become infinitely harder. It was June of 1883, and the harsh sun beat down on the small crowd that gathered for the burial, their faces grim with sympathy that would last only as long as the preacher's final words. Georgia stood alone by the fresh grave, her black dress borrowed from the undertaker's wife because she owned nothing suitable for mourning, her hands clutching a worn Bible that had been her mother's before consumption took her 3 years prior. She was 22 years old and utterly alone in a town that had little patience for unmarried women without family or fortune. Her father had been a ranch hand, honest but poor, and when a spooked horse kicked him in the chest during a routine drive, he left behind nothing but debts and a daughter with nowhere to go. Georgia had worked as a seamstress's assistant, but Mrs. Kemper had made it clear that morning that she could not afford to keep her on now, that there was no male relative to vouch for Georgia's character. The days following the funeral passed in a blur of closed doors and turned backs. Georgia went first to the boarding house where she and her father had rented a small room on the second floor. Mrs. Patterson, a severe woman with thin lips and calculating eyes, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her ample bosom. "I need rooms for paying tenants," Mrs. Patterson said before Georgia could even explain her situation. "Your father's last payment covered through yesterday. I will need you out by sundown." "Please," Georgia said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I can work for my keep. I can clean, cook, whatever you need." Mrs. Patterson's expression did not soften. "I have girls for that, girls with families in town who can vouch for them. I cannot have a woman of questionable circumstances living under my roof. It would not be proper." The door closed with a firm click, and Georgia stood on the wooden sidewalk feeling as though the ground might open beneath her feet. She gathered her few possessions, 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, and a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, and packed them into a small carpet bag that had seen better days. She tried the church next, thinking surely Reverend Michaels would show Christian charity. The Reverend received her in his small office adjacent to the sanctuary, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he listened to her plight. "Miss Harper," he said when she finished, his tone gentle but firm, "the church has limited resources. We help where we can, but we must prioritize families with children, the sick and elderly. A young, able-bodied woman such as yourself should have no trouble finding employment and lodging." "But I have been trying," Georgia protested. "Mrs. Kemper let me go, and Mrs. Patterson would not even consider." "Have you tried the saloon?" Reverend Michaels interrupted, then seemed to realize what he had suggested. His face reddened. "That is, perhaps they need someone to help with cooking or cleaning, though I would not recommend that path for a young woman of virtue." Georgia felt her cheeks burn. "I would never, of course not," he said quickly. "I only meant that you must explore all respectable options. Perhaps you have family elsewhere, relatives who might take you in." She shook her head, fighting back tears. Her father had been an only child, her mother the same. There was no one. The Reverend stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "I will pray for you, Miss Harper. God provides for those who have faith." But faith did not provide a roof over her head or food in her belly. Georgia spent the rest of that day going door to door, seeking any kind of work or shelter. She tried the general store, but Mr. Thornton said he had no need for help. She tried the hotel, but the manager took one look at her worn dress and shabby carpet bag and said they required employees who could present a more prosperous appearance. She tried the schoolhouse, but the teacher, Miss Abernathy, explained that the position required certification Georgia did not possess. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Georgia found herself standing in the middle of Main Street with nowhere left to go. Every door had been closed to her. Every offer of help had been refused. She was invisible to this town now, a ghost of a person without the framework of family or fortune to give her substance. She made her way to the edge of town, where a cluster of cottonwood trees offered some shade and privacy. She would have to sleep rough, at least for tonight, and figure out her next move in the morning. Perhaps she could walk to the next town, though that was a 2-day journey on foot through unforgiving desert terrain. Perhaps she could. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Georgia could make out more details. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing the practical clothes of a working cowboy: denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. A spotted Appaloosa moved beneath him with the easy gait of a well-trained mount. The rider slowed as he approached, and Georgia instinctively stepped back, clutching her carpetbag to her chest. Men on the road could mean trouble, especially for a woman alone. But something about this man's posture seemed unthreatening. He stopped a respectful distance away and tipped his hat, revealing a face that looked to be in his mid-20s, weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His eyes were a startling blue-green, the color of the desert sky just after a rare rainstorm. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice a deep baritone with the slight drawl of someone raised in the territories. "You look like you might be in some trouble." Georgia lifted her chin, trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. "I am fine, thank you." He glanced at her carpetbag, then at the cottonwoods behind her, and she could see him putting the pieces together. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you do not look fine. You look like someone who is planning to sleep under those trees, which is not safe for anyone but especially not for a woman alone." "I appreciate your concern," Georgia said stiffly, "but my circumstances are my own business." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate. Up close, he was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. There was a kindness in his eyes that made her chest ache. "My name is Ethan Fuller," he said. "I have been working a cattle drive up north, and I am passing through Roswell on my way to visit my brother's ranch outside of Lincoln. I could not help but notice that you seem to be in need of assistance." As I said, "I am fine." But even as she spoke, her stomach growled audibly, betraying the fact that she had not eaten since yesterday morning. Ethan Fuller's expression softened with sympathy. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Georgia felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. "That is none of your concern, Mr. Fuller." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I am making it my concern. There is a dining hall at the hotel that serves a decent supper. Would you allow me to buy you a meal?" "I cannot accept charity from a stranger," Georgia said, even as her traitorous stomach growled again. "Then consider it a favor," Ethan said. "I am new to town and could use some company for supper. You would be doing me a service by joining me, and in return you could tell me about Roswell." Fair trade, do you not think? Georgia knew she should refuse. A respectable woman did not dine alone with a strange man, but respectability seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford, and the thought of a hot meal made her mouth water. Besides, what did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters simply by virtue of being alone and homeless. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Fuller," he smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Please call me Ethan, and may I know your name?" "Georgia Harper." "Well, Miss Harper, let us get you some supper." They walked back toward the center of town, Ethan leading his horse by the reins. Georgia was acutely aware of the stares they attracted as they made their way to the hotel. Mrs. Patterson watched from the boarding house window, her face pinched with disapproval. Mr. Thornton paused in sweeping the sidewalk outside his general store to frown at them. Georgia lifted her chin and kept walking, determined not to show how much their judgment stung. The hotel dining room was nearly empty at this early hour, with just a few travelers picking at their meals. The manager, who had turned Georgia away that afternoon, looked up with a frown, but when he saw Ethan a paying customer, he plastered on a professional smile. "Table for two," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. They were seated in a corner near the window, and Ethan ordered the supper special for both of them along with coffee. When the food arrived, roast beef, potatoes, carrots, and fresh bread with butter, Georgia had to stop herself from falling upon it like a starving animal. She forced herself to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of manners, even as her body screamed for sustenance. Ethan ate without speaking, giving her time to satisfy the worst of her hunger before attempting conversation. Finally, when she had cleared half her plate and taken several sips of hot coffee, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with those remarkable eyes. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" he asked gently. "Why you were planning to sleep under those cottonwoods?" Georgia set down her fork, debating how much to reveal. But something about Ethan Fuller invited confidence. Perhaps it was his open, honest face. Perhaps it was simply that she had no one else to talk to. "My father died 5 days ago," she said. "He was a ranch hand, and a horse kicked him during a drive. We were not wealthy, and he left debts. I have been trying to find work and lodging, but every door has been closed to me. No one in this town wants to help a woman alone." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You have no other family, no one at all." She shook her head. "My mother died 3 years ago. I am alone, and the people of this town just turned you out." His voice held an edge of anger that was not directed at her. "They have their reasons," Georgia said, trying to be fair even though it hurt. "A woman without male protection is seen as a liability or worse, a moral threat. I understand their position, even if I wish it were different." "Their position is cruel and unchristian," Ethan said flatly. "Begging your pardon for my language, but that is the truth of it." Georgia felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. When was the last time someone had defended her? When had anyone stood up for her without expecting something in return? "Thank you for the meal," she said. "I do not know when I will be able to repay you, but I will find a way." Ethan waved a hand dismissively. "I do not want repayment, but I have an idea if you will hear me out." Georgia nodded, curious despite herself. "My brother owns a ranch about a day's ride from here," Ethan explained. "He and his wife have 3 young children and could use help around the house. I know they have been looking for someone to assist with cooking, cleaning, childcare, that sort of thing. It would be honest work with fair pay and a place to stay. If you are willing, I could take you there tomorrow and introduce you." It sounded too good to be true, which made Georgia immediately suspicious. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Ethan met her eyes steadily. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because I would hope someone would do the same for my sister if she were in your position. And because I have seen enough hardship in this world to know that sometimes people just need a helping hand." Georgia wanted to believe him. Every fiber of her being wanted to accept this offer and escape the nightmare her life had become. But years of her father's warnings about trusting strangers made her hesitate. "I do not know you," she said carefully. "For all I know, this could be some kind of trap." "It is not," Ethan assured her. "But I understand your caution. Tell you what, we can stop by the sheriff's office after supper, and I will explain the situation to him. He can send word to my brother to verify my story. Would that ease your mind?" The fact that he did not take offense at her suspicion actually made Georgia trust him more. A man with ill intentions would have tried to pressure her to make her feel guilty for doubting him. Ethan simply offered a reasonable solution. "Yes," she said, "that would help." They finished their meal, and true to his word, Ethan escorted her to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dawson was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick mustache and tired eyes. He listened to Ethan's explanation, then nodded. "I know the Fuller family," he said. "Ethan and his brother Edward are good men. If Edward is offering work, it would be legitimate." He turned to Georgia. "You could do worse than accepting this opportunity, Miss Harper. The Fuller Ranch is well respected, and Edward's wife is a fine woman." Georgia felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. "Thank you, Sheriff. I can send a telegram to Lincoln in the morning," Dawson continued. "Let Edward know you are coming. That way he will be expecting you." "I would appreciate that," Ethan said. They left the sheriff's office as the last light faded from the sky. Stars were beginning to appear, brilliant and countless in the vast desert sky. Georgia looked up at them, feeling a fragile hope kindling in her heart. "Where will you stay tonight?" Ethan asked. "I can pay for a room at the hotel if you need one." Georgia's instinct was to refuse, but she had already accepted so much from him. "That is very generous, but I cannot ask that of you." "You are not asking, I am offering." Ethan's tone was gentle but firm. "Please, Miss Harper. Let me do this one more thing. I promise I am not expecting anything in return except the knowledge that you are safe for the night." Georgia searched his face and found only sincerity. "All right, thank you." Ethan secured her a room at the hotel, paying for the night in advance. As the desk clerk handed her the key, Georgia turned to Ethan. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. Truly, Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My mother died when I was 15, he said finally. "She got sick, and my father had just died the year before in an accident at the ranch. For a while, Edward and I and our little sister were alone. People in our town helped us, gave us work, made sure we had food and shelter until Edward was old enough to take over the ranch. I have never forgotten that kindness, and I have tried to pay it forward whenever I can." "What happened to your sister?" Georgia asked. "She married a good man and moved to Santa Fe. They have a farm and 2 children. She is happy." Ethan smiled. "The point is, I know what it is like to be alone and afraid. I know what it is like when people help you for no other reason than it is the right thing to do. So that is what I am doing for you." Georgia felt tears welling up again, but this time she did not try to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." "Get some rest," Ethan said. "I will meet you here at dawn and we will head out to the ranch. It is about a day's ride on horseback, but we will take it slow." "I do not have a horse," Georgia pointed out. "You can ride double with me," Ethan said. "The Appaloosa is strong enough to carry 2. Georgia knew she should probably be concerned about the impropriety of riding in such close proximity to a man she barely knew, but at this point, she was beyond caring what the people of Roswell thought. They had already made their judgment clear. "I will be ready at dawn," she promised. That night, Georgia slept in a real bed for what she feared might be the last time in a long while. The sheets were clean and crisp, the mattress soft compared to the hard ground she had been prepared to sleep on. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Ethan Fuller. He was unlike any man she had ever met. Most men she encountered either ignored her completely or looked at her with a predatory interest that made her skin crawl. Ethan looked at her like she was a person deserving of respect and kindness. He had asked nothing of her except to accept his help, and even that he had offered in a way that preserved her dignity. She thought about his eyes, that unusual blue-green color that seemed to see right through her defenses. She thought about his hands, strong and capable but gentle when he had taken her carpetbag to carry it for her. She thought about his voice, deep and soothing, with a warmth that made her feel safe. Georgia had never had much time for romantic notions. Her father had needed her help, and after her mother died, she had focused all her energy on keeping their small household running. There had been a boy once, when she was 17, who had courted her for a few months before his family moved to California. But that had been a childish infatuation, nothing like the confusing tangle of emotions she felt when she thought about Ethan Fuller. She barely knew him, she reminded herself. One act of kindness did not mean anything beyond simple human decency. She would be a fool to read more into it than that. But still, as she finally drifted off to sleep, it was Ethan's face she saw in her dreams. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly all at once. Georgia woke before the sun, washed her face in the basin on the dresser, and put on her best dress, a simple green cotton that brought out the hazel in her eyes. She repacked her carpetbag carefully, making sure her mother's Bible and the family daguerreotype were wrapped safely in her spare chemise. When she came down to the hotel lobby, Ethan was already there, looking fresh despite having slept in the stable with his horse. He smiled when he saw her, and Georgia felt her heart do a little flip in her chest. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I will ever be," she replied. They stopped at the general store to purchase some supplies for the journey. Mr. Thornton frowned when Georgia entered with Ethan, but he took Ethan's money readily enough when the cowboy bought jerky, hardtack, canteens of water, and an extra blanket. "For the lady," Ethan said, handing the blanket to Georgia. "It can get cold at night, even in June." They made one more stop at the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Dawson confirmed he had sent the telegram to Edward Fuller. "He should receive it by this afternoon," Dawson said. "I expect you will be about halfway there by then." "Thank you, Sheriff," Ethan said, shaking the man's hand. As they walked to where Ethan had left his horse, Georgia noticed that more people were out and about, starting their daily routines. Mrs. Patterson stood on the porch of the boarding house, her expression sour as she watched them pass. Mrs. Kemper emerged from her shop and quickly looked away when Georgia met her eyes. Reverend Michaels hurried by on the opposite side of the street, suddenly very interested in the ground at his feet. "They do not seem happy to see you leaving," Ethan observed. "They are not happy that I existed in the first place," Georgia said with more bitterness than she intended. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Their small-mindedness is not a reflection on you, Georgia. Do not let them make you feel like you are less than you are." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you, Ethan." He helped her mount the Appaloosa, then swung up behind her. Georgia was acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins. She could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of her dress, could smell the scent of leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Yes," she managed, though comfortable was not exactly the word for what she was feeling. Hyper-aware, perhaps. Nervous and excited and terrified all at once. They rode out of Roswell as the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Georgia did not look back. There was nothing in that town for her anymore, only closed doors and cold shoulders. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Rocky outcroppings thrust up from the earth like the bones of some ancient giant. Sagebrush and creosote dotted the sandy ground, their roots deep enough to find water where it seemed none could exist. In the distance, mountains rose blue and hazy against the sky. Ethan kept the Appaloosa to a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a dry riverbed that only ran during the summer monsoons, a cluster of Joshua trees standing like sentinels at the edge of the desert. "You know this land well," Georgia observed. "I have been riding these territories since I was a boy," Ethan said. "My father used to bring Edward and me out here to teach us tracking and hunting. He said a man who did not understand the land would never survive in it. He sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Ethan agreed, and Georgia could hear the sadness in his voice. "He was thrown from a horse when I was 14, broke his neck. He died instantly, which I suppose was a mercy. My mother never recovered from losing him. I think that is what really killed her, even though the doctor said it was pneumonia." "I am sorry," Georgia said softly. "It must have been terrible to lose them both so young." "It was," Ethan admitted, "but Edward stepped up and kept us together. He was only 18, but he took over the ranch and made sure our sister and I were provided for. He is a good man, Georgia. You will like him, and his wife Catherine is one of the kindest people I have ever met." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Georgia found herself relaxing against Ethan's chest, her earlier tension melting away in the warmth of the sun and the steady rocking motion of the horse. Around midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a rocky overhang. Ethan helped Georgia down from the horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist. He tended to the Appaloosa first, making sure the animal had water and a chance to rest, before unpacking some of the jerky and hardtack for their own meal. "Not exactly a feast," he said apologetically, handing her a canteen and some of the dried meat. "It is more than I had yesterday," Georgia said. "I am grateful." They sat side by side on a flat rock, eating in companionable silence. Georgia studied Ethan when she thought he was not looking, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the weathered creases at the corners of his eyes, the capable way his hands moved as he ate. He was handsome in a rugged, practical way that had nothing to do with refinement and everything to do with competence and strength. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, breaking into her thoughts. "Of course. What do you want out of life?" "If you could have anything, be anyone, what would you choose?" Georgia was taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked her that before. Her life had been about survival, about getting through each day, not about dreams or ambitions. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I suppose I have never allowed myself to think that far ahead. When my mother was alive, I dreamed of maybe getting married someday, having children, a home of my own. But after she died, those dreams seemed foolish. My father needed me and I was content to care for him. And now—" Ethan pressed gently. "What do you dream of now?" Georgia looked out at the vast expanse of desert stretching before them, the endless sky above. "Now I dream of belonging somewhere," she said. "Of having a place where people want me, not just tolerate me. Of being able to build something, even if it is small. A life that is mine, where I am not just surviving but actually living." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Those are good dreams, honest dreams." "What about you?" Georgia asked, turning the question back on him. "What do you want?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I want what my brother has," he said finally. "A ranch of my own, a family, roots somewhere. I have been drifting for the past few years, working cattle drives, taking jobs where I can find them. It is a free life, but it is also a lonely one. I am 26 years old, and I feel like I have been running from something without knowing what I am running toward. Why do you not settle down then? Georgia asked. You clearly have the skills to make a good living. Money, Ethan said bluntly. Starting a ranch takes capital that I do not have. I have been saving what I can, but it is slow going. Maybe in a few more years, I will have enough to buy some land and build something of my own. Georgia felt a pang of sympathy. Here was a good man, hardworking and honest, held back by the same forces that had destroyed her own life, the lack of money and opportunity. The world was not fair, she thought. Good people suffered while those with wealth and privilege glided through life untouched by hardship. I hope you get your ranch, she said sincerely. You deserve it. Ethan looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Thank you, Georgia. That means more than you know. They finished their meal and mounted the horse again, continuing their journey northwest toward Lincoln. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and Georgia was grateful for the extra canteen Ethan had purchased. The landscape began to change as they traveled, becoming slightly less arid with more vegetation and the occasional tree. As the sun started its descent toward the western horizon, Ethan pointed ahead to where a collection of buildings was visible in the distance. That is the Fuller Ranch, he said, and Georgia could hear the affection in his voice. Home. As they drew closer, Georgia could make out more details. The main house was a sturdy adobe structure with a covered porch running along the front. There was a barn, several smaller outbuildings, corrals with horses and cattle, and what looked like a vegetable garden near the house. It was not grand, but it was well maintained and clearly prosperous. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a welcoming smile that lit up her face when she recognized Ethan. Ethan Fuller, you are a sight for sore eyes, she called out, hurrying down from the porch. Edward got the telegram from Sheriff Dawson. We have been expecting you. Ethan dismounted and helped Georgia down before embracing the woman warmly. Catherine, you look wonderful as always. Where is my brother? Out checking the north pasture fence, Catherine replied. He should be back soon. She turned her attention to Georgia, her smile warm and genuine. You must be Miss Harper. Welcome to our home. Thank you, Mrs. Fuller, Georgia said, suddenly feeling shy and uncertain. I appreciate you considering me for the position. Considering? Catherine laughed. My dear, if Ethan vouches for you, that is good enough for me. And please call me Catherine. We do not stand on formality around here. She linked her arm through Georgia's as though they were old friends. Let me show you inside and introduce you to the children. They are very excited to meet you. The inside of the house was warm and inviting, with whitewashed walls and simple but comfortable furniture. The smell of baking bread filled the air, and Georgia's stomach rumbled despite the jerky she had eaten earlier. 3 children appeared from various corners of the house, 2 boys who looked to be about 6 and 8, and a little girl no more than 4 with dark curls and enormous brown eyes. This is James, Thomas, and little Margaret, Catherine said, introducing each child. Children, this is Miss Harper. She is going to be helping Mama around the house. Are you going to live here? Margaret asked, her voice high and sweet. If your parents will have me, then yes, Georgia said, crouching down to the little girl's level. Will you play with us? Margaret asked hopefully. Margaret, let Miss Harper get settled first, Catherine chided gently. She has had a long journey. A door opened, and a man entered who could only be Edward Fuller. He was taller than Ethan and broader through the shoulders, with the same blue-green eyes and weather-beaten features. His face broke into a grin when he saw his brother. Ethan, About time you showed up. We have been worried about you." The brothers embraced, clapping each other on the back with the easy affection of men who were not afraid to show they cared. Edward then turned to Georgia, his expression kind. "Miss Harper, I presume. Welcome to our home." "Thank you, Mr. Fuller," Georgia said. "I am very grateful for this opportunity." "Edward, please," he said. "And the gratitude goes both ways. Catherine has been managing the house and the children on her own for too long. Having help will be a blessing for all of us." They spent the evening getting acquainted over a supper of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from Catherine's garden. Georgia learned that Edward and Catherine had been married for 9 years, having met when Catherine came west as a schoolteacher. The ranch had been in the Fuller family for 2 generations and was modestly successful, running cattle and horses primarily. The children were delightful, boisterous, and curious, full of questions about where Georgia had come from and what her favorite things were. Margaret, in particular, seemed to have attached herself to Georgia, insisting on sitting next to her at supper and holding her hand whenever possible. Ethan regaled them with stories from his recent cattle drive, making the children laugh with exaggerated accounts of stubborn steers and midnight stampedes. Georgia found herself laughing too, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. This was what a home should feel like, she thought. Warm and welcoming, full of laughter and love. After supper, Catherine showed Georgia to a small room off the kitchen that would be hers. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corrals. It was more than Georgia had dared to hope for. "I know it is not much," Catherine said apologetically, "but it is yours for as long as you want to stay." "It is perfect," Georgia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Catherine. You have no idea what this means to me." Catherine squeezed her hand. "We are glad to have you. Get some rest. Tomorrow I will show you around properly and we can discuss your duties. But do not worry, we are not slave drivers here. You will have plenty of time to yourself as well." After Catherine left, Georgia unpacked her few belongings, carefully placing her mother's Bible on the dresser next to the daguerreotype of her parents. She changed into her nightgown and crawled into bed, marveling at how much her life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday she had been homeless and hopeless, every door closed to her, every face turned away. Today she had a room of her own, a job, and something that felt almost like family. And it was all because of Ethan Fuller, a cowboy who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had shown her nothing but cruelty. She fell asleep thinking about his eyes, the way they crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and the steady beat of his heart against her back as they rode. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Georgia settled into her new life. Catherine was true to her word about not being a slave driver. Georgia's duties included helping with cooking, cleaning, mending, and watching the children when Catherine needed to help Edward with ranch work. But there was also time for rest, for walks around the property, for sitting on the porch in the evening and watching the sun set over the western hills. Ethan had planned to stay only a few days before moving on to his next job, but somehow those days stretched into a week, then 2. Edward always seemed to have one more task that could use Ethan's help: a fence that needed mending, cattle that needed moving, a new corral that needed building. And Ethan, who had claimed to be anxious to keep moving, seemed in no hurry to leave. Georgia tried not to read too much into it, but she could not help noticing the way Ethan's eyes followed her when she crossed the yard, the way he always seemed to be nearby when she needed help carrying something heavy or reaching something high. He was never inappropriate, never pushy, but his presence was a constant warm awareness at the edge of her consciousness. One evening, about 3 weeks after Georgia had arrived at the ranch, She was sitting on the porch after supper, mending one of Thomas's shirts that had torn at the seam. The children were in bed, and Edward and Catherine had gone for a walk together, a rare moment of privacy for the couple. The sun had just set, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and pink. Ethan emerged from the barn and made his way to the porch, settling himself on the steps near where Georgia sat in the rocking chair. He had his hat in his hands, turning it over and over in a way that suggested nervousness. "Beautiful evening," he said. "It is," Georgia agreed, not looking up from her mending. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what you said when we were riding here. About wanting to belong somewhere, to build something." Georgia looked up from her sewing, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Yes, I have been thinking about the same things," Ethan continued. "About wanting to settle down, start something of my own. I have been drifting for too long, Georgia. I am tired of it." "What are you saying?" Georgia asked, though part of her thought she might know. Ethan set his hat aside and turned to face her fully. "I am saying that I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the moment I first saw you standing under those cottonwood trees. I am saying that every day I spend here, I find more reasons to stay and fewer reasons to leave. I am saying that you make me want to be the kind of man who builds something instead of just wandering." Georgia's hand stilled on the fabric in her lap. Her mouth felt dry, her pulse racing. "Ethan, I know it is too soon," he said quickly. "I know I have no right to say these things when I have nothing to offer you but a cowboy's wages and a dream of someday owning land. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is real, Georgia. More real than anything I have felt in a long time." Georgia set aside her mending with trembling hands. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself that it is just gratitude for what you have done for me. But it is more than that, Ethan. When I am near you, I feel like I can breathe for the first time since my father died. When you look at me, I feel seen in a way I have never felt before." Ethan moved from the steps to kneel beside her rocking chair, taking her hands in his. His calloused palms were warm against her skin, his touch gentle despite the strength in those work-roughened hands. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to stay here and work for my brother while I save money, and I want to spend that time getting to know you, letting you get to know me. And if, at the end of that time, you feel the same way I do, I want to marry you, Georgia Harper. I want to build a life with you, a home, a family. I want to give you all those dreams you talked about." Tears were streaming down Georgia's face now, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. I would like that very much." Ethan's face broke into a smile so brilliant it could have lit up the darkening sky. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles tenderly. "You have made me the happiest man in New Mexico territory." Georgia laughed through her tears. "And you have given me back my life. You have given me hope." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, talking softly about their dreams for the future. Ethan told her about the piece of land he had his eye on, about 50 miles northeast of the Fuller Ranch, with good water and grazing. Georgia told him about the home she imagined building, with a garden and maybe some chickens, and children someday when the time was right. When Edward and Catherine returned from their walk, they found Ethan and Georgia still on the porch, sitting close together and talking quietly. Edward raised an eyebrow at his brother, and Ethan grinned. "I am going to stay on for a while if you will have me," Ethan said. "I have asked Georgia if I might court her, and she has agreed." Catherine let out a delighted laugh and clapped her hands together. "I knew it." "Did I not say so, Edward? I told you there was something between them." Edward smiled and extended his hand to his brother. "You have my blessing, Ethan, and I would be happy to have you stay on. Lord knows we can use the help around here." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Georgia's life. She threw herself into her work at the ranch, finding satisfaction in the daily rhythms of cooking, cleaning, and caring for the children. Margaret became her shadow, following her everywhere and insisting that Georgia tuck her in every night. The boys warmed to her as well, showing her their secret hideouts and teaching her how to skip stones in the creek that ran through the property. But the best part of each day was the time she spent with Ethan. He was true to his word about courting her properly. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, content to walk with her in the evening after supper, to sit beside her on the porch, to talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about the time he and Edward got lost in the mountains and had to survive for 3 days on berries and creek water before their father found them. About the horse he had raised from a foal that became his constant companion until it died of old age. About the first time he went on a cattle drive and thought he would die from exhaustion and saddle sores. Georgia told him about her mother, about learning to sew at her side and listening to her sing hymns while they worked. About her father's dreams of someday owning his own small ranch, dreams that died with him. About the loneliness of being the only child, of having no siblings to share the burden of her parents' care and eventual loss. Ethan was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions and never trying to minimize her grief or rush her through her memories. He seemed to understand that her past, painful as it was, had shaped who she was, and he wanted to know all of it. As autumn approached and the heat of summer began to fade, Ethan started making plans in earnest for their future. He had been saving every penny he earned from working for Edward, and combined with what he already had, he was getting close to having enough for a down payment on land. He and Georgia would ride out on Sunday afternoons, the one day when work on the ranch slowed, to look at the property he had his eye on. It was beautiful land. Georgia had to admit, rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine, a creek that ran year-round, and a natural spring that would provide water even during dry spells. She could picture the house they would build there, small at first but sturdy, with a porch facing west so they could watch the sunsets. "What do you think?" Ethan asked as they sat on their horses overlooking the property. "Can you see yourself being happy here?" Georgia looked out at the land, then at Ethan, his face hopeful and vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. "I could be happy anywhere with you," she said honestly. "But yes, I think this is perfect." Ethan reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am going to work as hard as I can to make this happen for us, Georgia. I promise you." "I know you will," she said. "And I will be right there beside you, working just as hard." They set a tentative wedding date for the following spring, which would give Ethan time to secure the land and start building at least the basic structure of a house. Catherine was thrilled, already planning what she called a proper frontier wedding with music and dancing and half the county in attendance. "I never had a big celebration when Edward and I married," Catherine said wistfully as she and Georgia peeled potatoes together one afternoon. "We just went to the justice of the peace with 2 witnesses. I do not regret it, but I would love to see you have something more festive." "I do not need anything fancy," Georgia protested. "As long as Ethan is there, that is all that matters." "Nonsense," Catherine said firmly. "Every bride deserves a day to remember. Let me do this for you, Georgia. You have become like a sister to me, and I want to celebrate your happiness properly." Georgia felt tears prick at her eyes. She had been alone for so long that the idea of having people who cared about her, who wanted to celebrate with her, was almost overwhelming. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything. You and Edward have given me so much." Catherine set down her paring knife and pulled Georgia into a hug. "You have given us just as much, dear girl. This family is better because you are in it." As winter approached, Ethan finalized the purchase of the land. It took every penny he had saved plus a loan from Edward. But on a cold December morning, Ethan Fuller became a landowner. That evening he came to Georgia with the deed in his hands, his eyes shining with pride and excitement. "It is ours," he said, showing her the document. "Well, mine legally, but ours in every way that matters. Our future, Georgia, right here in black and white." Georgia traced the words on the deed with her finger, marveling at how far she had come. 6 months ago, she had been standing in the street of Roswell with nowhere to go and no hope for the future. Now she was looking at a deed to land that would be her home, engaged to a man she loved more than she had thought possible to love anyone. "We should go back," she said suddenly. Ethan looked confused. "Back where?" "To Roswell," Georgia said. "I want to go back to that town where every door was closed to me, and I want to knock on every one of those doors with you there beside me." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Why would you want to do that? Those people turned their backs on you when you needed them most." "Exactly," Georgia said. "They saw me as nothing, as someone not worth helping. I want them to see that I am still here, that I survived without them, that I am building a good life despite their cruelty. I do not want revenge, Ethan. I just want them to know that their rejection did not destroy me." Ethan studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. If that is what you need, then we will do it. When do you want to go?" "After Christmas," Georgia said. "Before the wedding, I want to go back and show them who I have become." They made the trip to Roswell in early January, riding together on Ethan's Appaloosa, just as they had on that first journey 6 months earlier. But everything was different now. Georgia was not a desperate woman fleeing a town that had rejected her. She was engaged to be married, with a future ahead of her and a man who loved her riding at her back. The town looked exactly the same as it had when she left, the same dusty streets, the same buildings, the same people going about their business. But Georgia felt different. She sat straighter in the saddle, her chin lifted, her fear replaced by a quiet confidence. They went first to the boarding house where Mrs. Patterson had turned Georgia away. Ethan helped Georgia dismount, and together they walked up to the door. Georgia knocked firmly, and after a moment Mrs. Patterson opened it, her face souring when she recognized Georgia. "Miss Harper," she said coldly, "I did not expect to see you again." "Mrs. Patterson," Georgia said evenly, "I wanted to stop by and let you know that I found employment and lodging after I left Roswell. This is my fiancé, Ethan Fuller. We are to be married in the spring." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened slightly, flicking from Georgia to Ethan and back again. "I see. Well, congratulations, I suppose." "I also wanted to thank you," Georgia continued, and she could see the confusion on Mrs. Patterson's face. "Thank you for turning me away that day. If you had not, I would never have met Ethan, and I would never have found the life I have now. So in a way, your cruelty was a blessing." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red, and she started to sputter something, but Georgia had already turned away, taking Ethan's offered arm and walking back toward the street. She could feel the older woman's eyes boring into her back, but she did not care. That confrontation had not been about making Mrs. Patterson feel bad. It had been about Georgia reclaiming her own power. They went next to the general store, where Mr. Thornton was sweeping the front step. He looked up as they approached, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Mr. Thornton," Georgia said pleasantly, "I wanted to stop by and let you know that I am doing well. I found work at a ranch near Lincoln, and I am engaged to be married. This is Ethan Fuller, my fiancé. Mr. Thornton nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. That is good to hear, Miss Harper. I hope you will be very happy. Thank you, Georgia said. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. They moved on to the church, where Reverend Michaels was in his office preparing Sunday's sermon. He looked startled when Georgia and Ethan appeared in his doorway. Miss Harper, this is an unexpected surprise. Reverend Michaels, Georgia said, I wanted to update you on my situation. You said that God provides for those who have faith, and I wanted you to know that you were right. God provided, though not in the way you suggested. I found work and a home, and I found love. This is Ethan Fuller, my fiancé. We are to be married in the spring. The Reverend's expression was complicated, part relief, part guilt, part genuine happiness. I am very glad to hear it, Miss Harper. I prayed for you after you left. I worried about what might become of you. Your prayers were answered, Georgia said. I am doing well, better than I ever thought possible. I wanted you to know that. They left the church and walked slowly down Main Street, stopping at each place that had turned Georgia away. The hotel, where the manager looked embarrassed when Georgia introduced Ethan. The schoolhouse, where Miss Abernathy actually seemed pleased to hear about Georgia's good fortune. Mrs. Kemper's dress shop, where her former employer could barely meet her eyes. At each stop, Georgia introduced Ethan, announced their engagement, and thanked the person for their role in her journey. Some seemed genuinely happy for her. Others were clearly uncomfortable, aware on some level that their actions had been less than Christian. But all of them saw her differently now, not as a desperate woman with no options, but as someone who had survived, who had found her own way. The last stop was the edge of town, where the cottonwood trees stood that Georgia had planned to sleep under that fateful evening when Ethan first saw her. They dismounted and stood together in the shade, looking back at the town. How do you feel? Ethan asked, his arm around her waist. Georgia leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. I feel like I have closed a chapter, she said. Like I can finally let go of the hurt and anger and just move forward. They have no power over me anymore, Ethan. None at all. You are an amazing woman, Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. You took something that could have broken you and turned it into strength. I am in awe of you, Georgia Harper. Soon to be Georgia Fuller, she reminded him with a smile. Not soon enough, Ethan said, making her laugh. They rode back to the Fuller ranch as the sun set behind them, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. Georgia felt lighter than she had in months, as though some burden she had been carrying had finally been lifted. She had faced her past, acknowledged it, and let it go. Now there was only the future to look forward to. The winter passed in a flurry of preparation. Ethan spent every spare moment working on their house, with Edward and some of the neighboring ranchers helping when they could. It was not going to be a grand structure, but it would be solid and well built, with 2 rooms to start and plans to add more as their family grew. Georgia helped Catherine with the wedding preparations, sewing her own wedding dress from fabric that Ethan had purchased for her, a beautiful cream-colored silk that must have cost him a month's wages. She tried to protest the expense, but he had been adamant. You will only get married once, he had said. I want you to have something beautiful to remember it by. Catherine taught Georgia how to make the traditional New Mexico wedding cookies that would be served at the reception. And together, they planned a menu that would feed the dozens of people who had already promised to attend. Word of the wedding had spread throughout the county, and it seemed like everyone wanted to celebrate with them. As spring approached and the wedding date drew near, Georgia found herself thinking about her parents. She wished they could be there to see her married, to know that she had found happiness and love. But in a way, She felt their presence with her mother's in the Bible she would carry as she walked down the aisle, her father's in the work ethic and resilience he had instilled in her. The night before the wedding, Georgia could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the changes the past year had brought. This time tomorrow, she would be married. She would be Georgia Fuller, wife of Ethan, co-owner of a piece of land that represented not just property but possibility. There was a soft knock at her door, and Catherine entered carrying a candle. "I thought you might be awake," she said, settling herself on the edge of Georgia's bed. "I could not sleep the night before my wedding either." "Were you nervous?" Georgia asked. "Terrified," Catherine admitted with a laugh, "but also excited. It is a big step, Georgia, committing your life to someone else, but with the right person it is also the most wonderful thing in the world." "Ethan is the right person," Georgia said with certainty. "I have never been more sure of anything." "I know he is," Catherine agreed. "I have watched the two of you together, and I have seen how you bring out the best in each other. Ethan was always a good man, but with you he is even better. More grounded, more purposeful. And you, dear Georgia, have blossomed since you came here. You were so wounded when you arrived, so closed off. Now you are open and confident and so full of life." Georgia felt tears welling up. "Thank you for taking me in, Catherine. For giving me a chance when no one else would." "That was all Ethan," Catherine said, "but I am glad we did. You are family now, Georgia, and you always will be, no matter where life takes you." They embraced, and Georgia let herself cry a little, releasing the last of the fear and uncertainty she had been carrying. Tomorrow was the start of her new life, and she was ready for it. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with a warm spring breeze that carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. Georgia dressed with Catherine's help, putting on the cream silk dress and pinning up her dark hair with some of the wildflowers the children had picked for her. She looked at herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back radiant, confident, loved. The ceremony was held outdoors on the Fuller Ranch, with the mountains providing a spectacular backdrop. Chairs had been set up in rows, and it seemed like half the county had turned out to celebrate. Georgia stood at the back, her arm linked with Edward's, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of her own father. "You ready?" Edward asked, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "More than ready," Georgia said. The fiddler began to play, and Georgia walked slowly down the makeshift aisle, her eyes locked on Ethan waiting for her at the front. He was dressed in his best clothes, black trousers, a white shirt, a string tie, and a vest. His hair was neatly combed, and his face was clean-shaven. But it was his expression that made Georgia's heart soar, pure joy and love and wonder, as though he could not quite believe she was real. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher who traveled through the territory. He spoke of love and commitment, of two people becoming one, of the sacred bond of marriage. But Georgia barely heard the words. She was lost in Ethan's eyes, those remarkable blue-green depths that had first captured her attention so many months ago. When it came time for the vows, Ethan took both her hands in his and spoke in a voice that carried across the assembled guests. "Georgia, I promise to love you and honor you for all the days of my life. I promise to work hard to give you the life you deserve, to protect you, to cherish you, to be your partner in all things. You saved me from a life of drifting, and I promise to give you a home where you will always belong." Georgia's voice shook as she responded. "Ethan, I promise to love you and support you, to stand by your side through good times and bad, to build a life with you filled with laughter and love. You gave me hope when I had none, and I promise to honor that gift every day for the rest of my life." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Ethan kissed her, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Georgia felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was real. This was her life now. She was married to a man who loved her, standing on land that would be their home, surrounded by people who had become family. The reception was a joyous affair with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Georgia danced with Ethan, with Edward, with neighboring ranchers and their sons. She accepted congratulations and well wishes from dozens of people, many of whom she had never met before but who clearly respected Ethan and wished them well. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Ethan took Georgia's hand and led her away from the crowd. They walked together toward their new home, the small house that represented so much more than just walls and a roof. "Happy?" Ethan asked as they stood on the porch of their home, looking out at the land that stretched before them. "Happier than I have ever been," Georgia said truthfully. "I keep thinking about that night in Roswell when I thought my life was over. If someone had told me then that within a year I would be married and happy and starting a new life, I would not have believed them." Ethan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I was thinking about that night too, about how close I came to just riding past you. I almost did, you know. I was tired and ready to get to Edward's ranch, but something made me stop, made me turn around and go back." "I am glad you did," Georgia whispered against his chest. "So am I," Ethan said. "So am I." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The breeze rustled through the juniper trees, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. This was their beginning, Georgia thought. Their chance to build something beautiful and lasting. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. Building a working ranch from the ground up required back-breaking labor and long hours. There were times when Georgia fell into bed exhausted, her hands blistered from work, her muscles aching. There were times when money was so tight that they had to make difficult choices about what to buy and what to do without. But through it all, they had each other. On the hardest days, when everything seemed to be going wrong, they would stop and take a moment to appreciate what they had built together. They would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, hand in hand, reminding themselves that they were exactly where they wanted to be. Georgia proved to be a natural rancher's wife. She took to the work with enthusiasm, learning how to care for cattle, how to mend fences, how to manage the household accounts. She planted a large garden that provided vegetables for their table and extra to trade in town. She raised chickens for eggs and meat, and she started a small business selling baked goods to the other ranchers in the area. Ethan worked harder than Georgia had ever seen anyone work, determined to make their ranch successful. He was up before dawn and often did not come in until well after dark. But he always made time for Georgia, always made sure she knew how much he loved and appreciated her. On Sunday afternoons, they would take a break from work and ride out together, exploring their land and making plans for the future. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Georgia discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening after supper, nervous about how he might react. They had not planned for children so soon when they were still establishing the ranch. But Ethan's face lit up with such joy that her nervousness evaporated. He swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing like a boy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Georgia asked, though the answer was obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Ethan said, his hands cradling her face. "You have given me everything I ever wanted, Georgia Fuller. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Georgia suffered from severe morning sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, the physical demands of ranch work became increasingly difficult. But Catherine was there to help, making the journey from the Fuller Ranch several times a week to check on Georgia and assist with the heavier chores. Edward gave Ethan extra time off to care for Georgia, refusing to take no for an answer. "Family takes care of family," Edward said when Ethan tried to protest. "You were there for me when I needed you. Now let me be there for you." In December of 1885, Georgia gave birth to a healthy baby boy after a long and difficult labor. They named him Samuel, after Ethan's father, and from the moment Georgia held him in her arms, she understood a depth of love she had never imagined possible. Ethan was a devoted father, marveling at every tiny feature, every sound Samuel made. He would rock the baby for hours, singing off-key lullabies and telling stories about the ranch Samuel would someday help run. "He is going to grow up knowing he is loved," Ethan said one night as they sat together, Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "He is going to know what it means to have a family that sticks together, no matter what." "He will," Georgia agreed. "We will make sure of it." The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. The ranch slowly became more prosperous as Ethan's careful management and Georgia's thrifty household practices paid off. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, with enough to meet their needs and a little extra set aside for emergencies. Samuel grew into a bright, curious child who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. When he was 3, Georgia gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth after Ethan's mother. The little girl had her father's blue-green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she was the apple of everyone's eye. The children filled their home with laughter and noise and occasional chaos. Georgia would sometimes think back to those dark days in Roswell when she had been so alone, when every door had been closed to her. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a story about a different person. That frightened, desperate woman had been transformed by love and hard work into someone confident and capable, someone who knew her own worth. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Georgia by taking her back to Roswell. They left the children with Edward and Catherine and made the 2-day journey on horseback, camping under the stars just as they had on their first trip together. When they reached Roswell, Ethan did not take her to any of the places Georgia had visited on her previous return. Instead, he led her to a small plot of land at the edge of town where a simple stone marker stood. "I bought this plot," Ethan explained. "I had markers made for your parents and had them placed here. I thought you might like to have a place to visit to remember them." Georgia stared at the 2 markers, one for her father, one for her mother, and felt tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, how did you?" "I tracked down the location where they were buried," he said gently. "I spoke to the undertaker, got the details right. I wanted you to have this, Georgia. A place to honor their memory properly." Georgia threw her arms around her husband, overcome with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding how much this means." They spent an hour at the gravesite, Georgia telling Ethan stories about her parents that she had never shared before. She told him about her father's terrible singing voice and her mother's habit of humming while she worked. She told him about the time her father brought home a stray puppy that turned out to be half wolf and caused all kinds of trouble. She told him about her mother's recipe for apple pie that Georgia had never been able to quite replicate. Ethan listened to it all, asking questions and sharing in her memories. When they finally stood to leave, Georgia felt a sense of peace she had not realized she was missing. Her parents were gone, but their memory was honored, and she had built a life they would have been proud of. As they rode away from Roswell, Georgia looked back one last time at the town that had rejected her. She felt no anger, no bitterness, only a profound gratitude for the journey that rejection had set her on. If those doors had not been closed, she would never have met Ethan. She would never have discovered her own strength and resilience. She would never have known the depth of love and happiness she now experienced every day. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I am thinking that every closed door led me to you," Georgia said. "And I would not change a single moment of that journey, as hard as it was, because it brought me here." Ethan reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers as he had done so many times before. "You know what I love most about you?" he asked. "What?" "Your ability to find the light even in the darkest moments. Your capacity to forgive, to grow, to build something beautiful out of ashes. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Georgia Fuller." They rode on through the desert, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Ahead of them lay their home, their children, their future. Behind them lay the past, honored and remembered but no longer defining them. The ranch continued to thrive over the following years. Ethan's hard work and smart decisions paid off, and they were able to expand their operation, purchasing additional cattle and horses. They built an addition onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Georgia's garden grew to include fruit trees and berry bushes, and she started making preserves that became highly sought after throughout the county. Samuel grew into a capable young man who took to ranch work as naturally as his father had. Elizabeth proved to have a gift with horses, able to gentle even the most spirited animals with patience and kindness. In 1892, Georgia gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Daniel and Rose. The house was loud and busy and full of life. Everything Georgia had dreamed of during those lonely days after her father's death. Edward and Catherine remained close, their children growing up alongside Georgia and Ethan's, more like cousins than merely the children of friends. The two families helped each other through good times and bad droughts and storms, illness and injury, births and deaths. They were not just neighbors but true family, bound together by love and loyalty. As Georgia entered her 40s, she sometimes caught herself marveling at the life she had built. She would stand on her porch in the early morning, watching the sun rise over land that she and Ethan owned, listening to the sounds of her children beginning their day, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. One morning, Ethan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Georgia said. "How far we have come, how blessed we are." "Do you ever think about that night in Roswell?" Ethan asked. "When I first saw you." "Sometimes," Georgia admitted. "Do you?" "All the time," Ethan said. "I think about how close I came to riding past, to not stopping, and I thank God every day that I did stop, that I went back." Georgia turned in his arms to face him. They were both older now, with lines on their faces and gray threading through their hair. But when she looked at Ethan, she still saw the young cowboy who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had shown her cruelty. She still felt that flutter in her chest when he smiled at her. "I love you," she said. "More now than I did on our wedding day, and I did not think that was possible." "I love you too," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You are my everything, Georgia. My home, my heart, my reason for getting up every morning." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the day began in earnest around them. From inside the house came the sound of children arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. In the corral, one of the horses whinnied. A rooster crowed, though it was well past dawn. These were the sounds of home, Georgia thought. The sounds of a life well lived, of love given and received, of dreams realized through hard work and dedication. Every door that had been closed to her in Roswell had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this beautiful, messy, perfect life. And when Ethan had gone back and knocked on those doors with her there beside him, it had not been about revenge or proving anything to the people who had rejected her. It had been about reclaiming her power, about showing herself that she had survived and thrived despite their cruelty. It had been about closing that chapter so she could fully embrace the new one that had begun. As the years continued to pass, Georgia and Ethan became pillars of their community. They were known for their generosity, always willing to help a neighbor in need, to provide a meal for a traveling family, to offer work to someone down on their luck. They had not forgotten where they came from, had not forgotten what it felt like to have doors closed in your face. Samuel married a girl from Lincoln and brought her to work the ranch alongside him. Elizabeth met a young veterinarian at a county fair and fell deeply in love, eventually moving to Santa Fe but visiting often with her growing family. Daniel developed a passion for horses and started a breeding program that became renowned throughout the territory. Rose, always the scholar of the family, became a teacher and opened a small school on the edge of their property to educate the children of neighboring ranches. Georgia and Ethan became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and growing in ways they never could have imagined during those early lean years. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that rivaled their original wedding celebration. Nearly 100 people gathered at the ranch, spilling out from the expanded house into the yard, sharing food and stories and laughter. As Georgia sat in a rocking chair on the porch, surrounded by the evidence of the life she and Ethan had built, she thought about that frightened young woman standing under the cottonwood trees in Roswell. She wanted to reach back through time and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that the closed doors were not the end but the beginning, that there was a cowboy riding toward her who would change everything. But that woman had found her own way, with Ethan's help. She had discovered her own strength, had built her own future. And that journey, difficult as it had been necessary. It had shaped Georgia into the woman she became: resilient, compassionate, strong, capable of deep love and fierce loyalty. Ethan settled into the rocking chair beside her, taking her hand in his as they watched their family celebrate. His hands were gnarled with arthritis now, but his grip was still strong, still sure. "We did all right, did we not?" he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a life well lived. "We did more than all right," Georgia said. "We built something beautiful." She looked out at their grandchildren playing in the yard, at their children deep in conversation with friends and neighbors, at the land that had been transformed from raw desert into a thriving ranch. This was their legacy, not just the land and the buildings, but the family, the community, the love that had spread out from two people who had found each other when they both needed saving. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in the brilliant colors Georgia had come to know so well over 50 years of watching from this porch, she leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had loved each other through every trial and triumph, who had built a life together from nothing but determination and faith in each other. "Thank you," Georgia said quietly. "For what?" Ethan asked. "For stopping that night, for going back, for knocking on every door with me when I needed to face my past, for giving me a future I never dreamed was possible." Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me just as much, Georgia. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. You took a drifting cowboy and turned him into a man with roots. We saved each other, Georgia said. Yes, Ethan agreed. We did. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, the party continued around them. But Georgia and Ethan remained on the porch, rocking gently, hands clasped, hearts full. They had traveled a long road together, from those desperate days in Roswell to this moment of peace and contentment. Every door that had been closed to Georgia had led her to this. Every rejection had been a redirection toward the life she was meant to live. And when Ethan had gone back to knock on those doors with her there beside him, he had given her the gift of facing her past from a position of strength rather than weakness. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic heroics. It was a story of kindness offered and accepted, of two people choosing to build something together, of love that grew deeper with each passing year. It was a story of the American West, of people carving out lives in harsh land, of families and communities coming together to survive and eventually thrive. As Georgia and Ethan finally rose from their rocking chairs to rejoin the celebration, they walked hand in hand as they had done for 50 years. They moved slower now, their steps not as sure as they once were, but they moved together, supporting each other as they always had. The party lasted well into the night, filled with music and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from a life well lived and love generously shared. And when it finally ended and the last guest had departed, when the house was quiet again, and Georgia and Ethan lay in the bed they had shared for 5 decades, Georgia felt at perfect peace. She had found her home, not just in the physical sense of the ranch and the house, but in the deeper sense of belonging to someone and having them belong to you. She had found her purpose in the family she had raised and the community she had helped build. She had found her happiness in the quiet moments and the grand celebrations, in the everyday routines and the special occasions. Every door had been closed to her that day in Roswell. But Ethan had come back and knocked on every one of them with her there beside him, showing her that closed doors were not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter. And what a chapter! It had been filled with love and laughter, with trials overcome and joys celebrated, with a family that stretched across generations, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. As Georgia drifted off to sleep that night, her last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. She had been given a second chance when she had no reason to expect one. She had been shown kindness when the world had been cruel. She had been loved when she was alone. And she had spent the rest of her life paying that forward, showing the same kindness to others that Ethan had shown to her. Their story was complete, their journey fulfilled. From closed doors to open hearts, from desperation to contentment, from loneliness to a love that would echo through generations. It was a good life, Georgia thought as sleep claimed her. A very good life indeed.